What is deadlier than a buried secret? The arrogant fool digging it up. I spent 5 years hiding my past as an ordinary wife, learning to walk seamlessly on a titanium leg. By making me his punchline at a lavish dinner, my millionaire brother-in-law unknowingly pulled the pin on a live grenade. He thought he was exposing a nobody. Instead, he awakened a ghost the Pentagon feared. When the explosion settles, I will not be the one shattered. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Sienna Rivera. I am 34 years old, and for the past 5 years, my absolute greatest battlefield has been the suffocating, money-soaked dining rooms of America's upper crust. Tonight, the theater of war was an obscenely expensive Michelin-starred restaurant located in the heart of downtown Denver, Colorado. High above our heads, massive crystal chandeliers cast a cold, sharp light over tables populated by people who wore their immense wealth like physical armor. The air in the room was incredibly thick, saturated with the overwhelming scent of white truffles, aged vintage wine, and a raw, unfiltered arrogance that only old money can buy. I sat perfectly quiet, carefully adjusting the heavy fabric of my floor-length black silk gown. It was an exceptionally elegant piece, chosen specifically because the thick hem gracefully and entirely concealed the titanium prosthetic that replaced my left leg. I had spent years in agonizing physical therapy perfecting the art of masking the slight, unnatural stiffness in my daily stride. To the influential billionaires, pampered socialites, and aggressive hedge fund managers gathered in this opulent room, I was nothing more than just another polished, quiet wife desperately trying to blend into the background of a high society world I clearly did not belong to. Beside me sat my husband, Julian. He is a brilliant, gentle architectural designer who builds homes with a fundamental warmth that completely contradicts the icy blood running through his own family's veins. Julian loves me deeply and unconditionally, but in the overwhelming presence of his bloodline, he always shrinks. He becomes a quiet shadow, entirely eclipsed by the overbearing gravity of his older brother, Marcus. Marcus was the undisputed center of our large dining table, and he viciously demanded that everyone acknowledge it. He is a highly successful real estate tycoon whose massive ego enters a room 10 full minutes before he actually does. For the past 2 hours, he had completely monopolized the entire conversation, his booming voice an inescapable, oppressive force. He loudly and obnoxiously dissected his latest $25 million commercial property acquisitions, casually name-dropped powerful local politicians as if they were his personal errand boys, and relentlessly demeaned the hardworking waitstaff just to showcase his perceived superiority over the working class. Every single word that fell out of his mouth was precisely calculated to remind us that he was the apex predator of Denver, and the rest of us were just incredibly lucky to be allowed in his feeding grounds. Eventually, Marcus grew utterly bored of endlessly bragging about himself. His predatory gaze drifted lazily across the table, visually scanning the faces for a brand new source of entertainment, and his eyes landed squarely on me. I had recently submitted my resignation from a quiet desk job, a carefully fabricated civilian role that served as my soft landing into a normal, unremarkable life. I called it a boring state office gig. Marcus, however, viewed it as a prime opportunity for public humiliation. "So, Sienna," Marcus suddenly announced, his voice slicing sharply through the polite ambient chatter and forcing the entire table of 12 to look directly at me. "Julian tells me you finally quit that miserable little paper-pushing job of yours. What an absolute tragedy for the state government. Who is going to organize the dusty file cabinets now?" A few of his wealthy, sycophantic friends chuckled obediently. Julian tensed immediately beside me, his jaw tightening with visible frustration. but he did not speak a single word. He never did when Marcus was on a destructive roll. You know, I always found it genuinely fascinating, Marcus continued relentlessly, slowly swirling the dark red wine in his expensive crystal glass. You told us once that you spent some brief time in the military before you met my little brother. But you never really talk about it. Probably because there is not much to actually talk about, right? Without warning, Marcus stood up from his leather chair. He puffed out his chest dramatically and threw his hand up to his forehead in a wildly exaggerated, downright ridiculous salute, deliberately mocking the sacred uniform I had once bled in. "Tell us the honest truth, Sienna," he sneered, intentionally projecting his loud voice so that the neighboring tables could hear every word. "What was your actual rank? Were you the lead coffee secretary for the army? Did you bravely defend the break room from a critical shortage of sugar packets?" The entire table erupted. The forced, snide laughter of the Denver elite echoed harshly in my ears. The glamorous women covered their mouths with manicured hands, and the men shook their heads in pure amusement. They were laughing gleefully at the quiet, supposedly unremarkable woman who was clearly drowning out of her depth. I did not flush with sudden anger. I did not raise my voice or attempt to loudly defend myself. That kind of predictable, emotional reaction was exactly the fuel a bully like Marcus thrived on. Instead, I simply offered a faint, perfectly placid smile. I reached out, my hand remaining flawlessly steady, and picked up my heavy wine glass. Absolute silence, I had learned through brutal experience long ago, was the ultimate survival tactic in hostile territory. Let the enemy firmly believe they have won. Let them revel blindly in their own arrogance. I calmly brought the glass toward my lips. Suddenly, the harsh screech of a heavy wooden chair violently dragging against the polished marble floor completely shattered the table's symphony of laughter. At the table directly next to ours, an older man deliberately stood up. He was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal civilian suit, but the luxurious clothes could not possibly disguise the absolute, undeniable military authority radiating from his stiff posture. His back was rigidly straight, his shoulders were broad, and his weathered eyes held the cold, calculating weight of a man who had watched empires burn to the ground. This was Lieutenant General Arthur Sterling, a living, breathing military legend, and he was staring directly at our table. The mocking laughter abruptly died in the dry throats of Marcus's friends. The oppressive, noisy atmosphere of the luxury restaurant seemed to instantly freeze into solid ice. Marcus, immediately sensing a territorial challenge to his dominance, puffed up his chest and confidently opened his mouth to confront the old man. General Sterling completely and utterly ignored Marcus. He did not even register the millionaire's pathetic existence. The general's piercing, battle-hardened gaze bypassed the arrogant tycoon like he was thin air and locked firmly, intensely onto me. He stepped closer. The entire dining room collectively held its breath in terrified anticipation. General Sterling stopped abruptly, squared his broad shoulders, and gave me a slow, deeply solemn nod of profound respect. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a shout, but it carried a terrifying, commanding steel that echoed violently through the dead, stunned silence of the room. "Do you still use the callsign Valkyrie, ma'am?" The phrase hung suspended in the chilled air of the dining room. That single, heavily weighted word, ma'am, spoken with absolute, unwavering deference by a man wearing 3 invisible stars on his broad shoulders, slammed into our table with the devastating force of a freight train. It instantaneously crushed the smug, sneering grin right off Marcus's face. The harsh, arrogant laughter of his wealthy friends choked and died in their throats. The clinking of heavy silver forks against fine porcelain plates ceased completely. The entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying shift in gravity. I felt my own lungs seize. My fingers, resting elegantly on the stem of my crystal wine glass, went completely numb. Valkyrie. That name did not belong in a glamorous Denver restaurant. It was a ghost from a buried life. That call sign belonged exclusively to the Echo Directive, a deeply classified, Black Operations Tactical Intelligence Unit that officially did not exist on any government ledger. Hearing it spoken aloud tasted of bitter copper blood, choking desert dust, and the agonizing, echoing screams of brave teammates I could not bring home. It was the sacred, terrible name I bore when I left a physical, bleeding piece of my own body behind in the mud of a nameless ravine halfway across the world. I slowly set my wineglass down onto the crisp, white tablecloth. The placid, polite, and perfectly agreeable suburban wife vanished in a fraction of a second. My spine snapped perfectly straight, an automatic muscle memory overriding 5 exhausting years of civilian conditioning. "That call sign is permanently retired, sir," I answered. My voice was no longer soft or accommodating. It was forged steel, clipped, hollow, and frighteningly flat, carrying the precise, disciplined cadence of a seasoned operative confirming a secure line. But I acknowledged the designation. General Sterling did not press for details. A man of his immense caliber intimately understood the lethal, suffocating silence required by the Echo Directive. He simply straightened his posture, brought his right hand up in a flawless, razor-sharp military salute, and held it there for 3 agonizingly long seconds. Then, he turned sharply on his heel and marched out of the restaurant, leaving behind a massive vacuum of absolute, paralyzing shock. Marcus stared at me, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocating fish on a dry dock. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, placed it neatly on the table, and quietly told Julian it was time to leave. The ride back to our house was suffocating. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers pushing away a sudden drizzle was the only sound. The passing streetlights flashed rhythmically across Julian's pale, deeply confused face. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. "Sienna," he finally whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and betrayal. "What was that? Who was that man? You told me you just pushed papers at a desk." I looked out the dark passenger window, watching the wet city lights blur into streaks of neon. "I told you what you needed to hear so we could have a normal, quiet life, Julian." I paused, carefully selecting a calculated half-truth that would satisfy his immediate panic without triggering federal treason charges. I did not serve coffee. I coordinated emergency medical evacuation units, medevac. I pulled critically wounded soldiers out of active hostile fire zones. It was incredibly loud. It was unimaginably bloody, and I am permanently done talking about it. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He nodded exactly once, entirely too intimidated by the cold, hardened stranger sitting in his car to push the interrogation any further. I did not know it then, but while Julian and I pulled into our quiet suburban driveway, a wildly different scene was violently unfolding across town. At his sprawling $20 million estate, Marcus was actively losing his mind. His fragile, gargantuan ego simply could not process what had just occurred. To be publicly dismissed, entirely ignored, and completely overshadowed by a quiet woman he considered fundamentally beneath him was not just a social insult. To a man like him, it was a profound psychological violation. A normal, rational person would have felt a sharp twinge of embarrassment, or perhaps even apologized for crossing a terrible line. But Marcus was a narcissist of the highest, most dangerous order. His twisted, frantic brain immediately began constructing a desperate alternate reality to protect his shattered pride. He poured himself a massive glass of expensive scotch and paced the length of his dark mahogany study, muttering violently to himself. He fiercely convinced himself that General Sterling was either going senile, had been deeply mistaken, or had simply played along with a joke. Or worse, he decided that I was an incredibly elaborate, manipulative con artist. By midnight, Marcus was hunched over his glowing computer screens, aggressively hammering my name into every search engine, public database, and veteran forum he could find. He searched for Sienna Rivera. He furiously typed in the Callsign Valkyrie. He combed methodically through endless digital archives of military personnel, unclassified deployment rosters, and public medal citations. He spent over 4 hours clicking frantically through hundreds of pages until his eyes burned red. He found absolutely nothing. 0 records. There was no honorable discharge, no deployment history, no basic training graduation photo, and no mention of my name anywhere in the vast, limitless expanse of the internet. A sane man would realize that finding absolutely 0 digital footprint on a supposedly ordinary modern veteran was highly unusual, a massive red flag screaming of high-level classified redactions. But Marcus was completely blinded by his own arrogance. To him, the complete and total emptiness of the data was the ultimate vindication. In his warped, furious mind, the total lack of evidence was ironclad proof that I had faked the entire military persona. As the large grandfather clock in his hallway struck 4 o'clock in the morning, Marcus smiled a bitter, venomous smile in the dark. He had found his new, toxic obsession, and he was firmly resolved to utterly destroy me. For exactly 21 days, the Rivera family group chat transformed into a relentless, suffocating masterclass in psychological warfare. Marcus did not possess the courage to confront me directly. Instead, he deployed the coward's ultimate tactic, dropping endless, venomous little hints heavily disguised as genuine brotherly concern. He forwarded lengthy, pseudo-psychological articles detailing the severe symptoms of megalomania and compulsive lying disorders. He would tag Julian in long, rambling, dramatically punctuated messages, openly questioning whether I had ever exhibited troubling signs of stolen valor or deep-seated delusions of grandeur. He methodically planted poisonous seeds of doubt, trying to convince the entire extended bloodline that poor, naive Julian had accidentally married a highly dangerous, mentally unstable fraud. I chose absolute, unwavering silence. I had survived interrogations in hostile territories. I was not going to break over a group chat. Besides, I had much larger, intensely physical battles to fight. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I endured excruciating physical therapy sessions. The custom titanium socket of my prosthetic leg had been aggressively chafing against the severely damaged nerve endings of my residual limb. The friction created deep, raw, weeping blisters that made every single mundane step feel exactly like grinding bare bone against a pile of shattered glass. I gritted my teeth through the blinding agony, focusing entirely on recalibrating my physical balance and maintaining the fragile, quiet peace of my suburban marriage. Julian was already visibly fraying at the edges from the constant, heavy family tension. His shoulders perpetually slumped under the weight of his brother's hostility. I adamantly refused to give Marcus the twisted satisfaction of watching our quiet home crumble from the inside out. But my ironclad refusal to engage only poured high-octane gasoline on his raging inferiority complex. Denied the explosive, tearful reaction he desperately craved, Marcus decided to unilaterally escalate the situation. He moved abruptly from petty familial bullying into the highly illegal territory of federal espionage. Tapping into his vast, shadowy network of ruthless corporate fixers, Marcus hired a disgraced former police detective turned high-end private investigator. This particular operative specialized exclusively in aggressive corporate espionage and illegal deep web data extraction, charging an exorbitant, non-refundable fee of $50,000 just to open his secure laptop. Marcus summoned this investigator to his sprawling glass-walled penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. He handed the man a single, explicitly clear directive. He wanted my military personnel file cracked wide open, fully expecting the hacker to easily unearth the pathetic, heavily redacted records of a disgraced, low-level administrative clerk. Exactly 3 days later, the private investigator demanded an urgent, strictly face-to-face meeting. He arrived at Marcus's corporate headquarters sweating profusely, his hands visibly shaking as he placed a heavily encrypted, reinforced tablet onto the polished mahogany desk. "I cannot touch this woman, Marcus," the investigator warned, his voice cracking with a very genuine, visceral terror. "I dug deep into the Department of Defense archive mainframes. Her personal file is not missing. It is not simply erased or redacted with black marker. It is currently secured under a black ice defense protocol." Marcus frowned deeply, swirling the expensive amber bourbon in his heavy crystal glass. "Speak plain English to me. What the hell does that actually mean?" "It means her digital footprint is a highly lethal, actively rigged trap," the investigator explained frantically, wiping his slick forehead. "Black ice is the absolute highest security classification level in the intelligence community. It is exclusively reserved for phantom operatives, top-tier high-value intelligence assets, and literal ghosts. If you even so much as knock on the digital front door of a black ice encrypted file, the defense system does not just passively lock you out. It actively hunts you down. It aggressively traces your internet protocol address. It pinpoints your exact physical location, and it instantly alerts federal agencies that do not even have public acronyms. I am telling you to walk away from this right now before you get us both killed." A rational, sane human being would have paid the frightened man his money and immediately burned the hard drive. But Marcus was utterly blinded by his monumental, unchecked arrogance. His twisted, narcissistic logic immediately deduced that the military was simply overprotecting a massive, highly embarrassing administrative scandal. He genuinely believed I had committed some egregious, shameful act, like embezzling government funds or engaging in a scandalous, career-ending affair, and some sympathetic brass was burying the evidence under heavy digital encryption to save face. "I do not pay you to be a pathetic coward," Marcus snarled viciously, slamming his fist down hard onto the expensive desk. "I will double your extraction fee right now, $100,000 in untraceable wire transfers. I want you to deploy every single piece of malicious malware you own. Break that firewall tonight. Expose her lies." Raw greed ultimately conquered rational fear. The investigator reluctantly agreed, launching a highly sophisticated, brute-force digital assault against my classified military dossier. That exact same night, at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, I shot awake in my pitch-dark bedroom. Julian was sleeping soundly beside me, his chest rising and falling rhythmically, completely oblivious to the faint, high-pitched, vibrating hum echoing from the very back of my walk-in closet. My blood instantly turned to freezing Freon. I slipped silently out from under the warm duvet, ignoring the sharp, stinging pain shooting up my damaged leg, and moved swiftly toward the closet. I pushed aside a heavy row of winter coats, revealing a hidden, flush-mounted biometric wall safe securely bolted directly into the steel framework of the house. I firmly pressed my right thumb against the green glowing scanner. The heavy steel door hissed open with a soft, mechanical click. Sitting quietly in the dark velvet interior was a bulky, heavily encrypted military satellite phone. It had been completely powered off for exactly 5 years, dead to the world since the very day I was honorably discharged. Now, the small digital screen was glowing an angry, pulsing blood red, and the device was violently vibrating against the metal shelf. I picked it up, my hands completely steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins, and pressed the secure receive button. "This is Valkyrie," I whispered into the suffocating darkness of the closet. "Valkyrie, this is Control," a familiar, heavily graveled voice replied instantly. It was my former commanding officer from the Echo Directive, a man who officially did not exist on any government payroll. "We have a highly critical situation. Someone just deployed military-grade malware to battering ram the front gates of your Level 5 classified dossier." "Did they successfully breach the firewall?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that Julian had never heard. "Negative," Control replied grimly. "But they aggressively tripped the tripwire. The Black Ice Autonomous Counteroffensive Protocol has been fully activated. The defense system successfully traced the digital intrusion directly back to a private commercial server located in downtown Denver. The Department of Homeland Security and the Cyber Command Rapid Response Teams have already been dispatched. They are treating this active intrusion as a high-level national security threat. Who exactly registered the server, Control? I asked quietly, though a sickening knot in my stomach already knew the disastrous answer. A major real estate holding firm completely owned by a man named Marcus Rivera, the commander stated flatly. Do you know him? I closed my eyes tightly, leaning my forehead against the cold, unyielding steel of the open wall safe. Marcus had finally done it. He had completely bypassed the trivial realm of petty family drama and proudly, arrogantly, marched himself straight into the heavily armed crosshairs of the federal government. Yes, I replied softly. He is my brother-in-law. Then you better pray to God he has a phenomenal lawyer, Control said coldly. Because the hounds are officially off the leash, Valkyrie, and they are coming for blood. The secure line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the heavy phone, the pulsing red glow illuminating my grim, hardened reflection in the mirror. Marcus honestly thought he was cleverly unmasking a weak, defenseless woman to stroke his own massive, fragile ego. He had absolutely no idea that his little digital hammer had just struck a live thermonuclear warhead. He had gleefully crossed the ultimate red line, awakening a ruthless, unforgiving shadow system that would not hesitate to tear his entire opulent world completely apart. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, Marcus stood at the head of a massive, polished oak conference table on the 45th floor of his corporate headquarters. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, aggressively gesturing with an expensive fountain pen as he lectured a room full of highly influential billionaire investors. He was right in the middle of closing a lucrative $300 million commercial merger, completely convinced that he was the untouchable king of the world. He had absolutely no idea that his reign was about to end in spectacularly humiliating fashion. Down on the street level, an armada of 6 matte black, heavily armored sport utility vehicles violently jumped the concrete curb, screeching to a chaotic halt directly in front of his glass lobby. Pedestrians screamed and scattered as dozens of federal agents clad in thick tactical body armor and carrying matte black assault rifles swarmed out of the vehicles. They did not pause at the reception desk. They bypassed security completely, commandeering the private executive elevators with override codes the building management did not even know existed. Up in the boardroom, Marcus was just leaning forward to deliver his final, arrogant pitch when the heavy double doors were violently kicked open, the reinforced wood splintering off the hinges. "Federal agents, get down on the ground right now!" a booming voice roared over the sudden chaos. The room of powerful billionaires instantly descended into pure panic. Elderly investors dove under the expensive oak table, covering their heads. Marcus stood completely frozen in shock, his expensive pen slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the floor. Before he could even open his mouth to demand an explanation, 2 heavily armored tactical operatives grabbed him by his custom-tailored shoulders, violently sweeping his legs out from under him. His face slammed hard into the expensive carpet. Cold, rigid zip ties were brutally ratcheted around his wrists. In the corner of the room, the private investigator he had hired was also dragged out from a side office, screaming and begging for his life. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Marcus shrieked, his face turning an angry, blotchy purple as they hauled him roughly to his feet. "I will have your badges for this. I will sue the federal government." The lead agent did not even blink. He publicly marched Marcus out of his own boardroom, parading the humiliated, zip-tied tycoon past his horrified employees, his wealthy partners, and the flashing cameras of local news reporters who had caught wind of the raid. It was a masterpiece of dark, poetic justice. For the next 12 excruciating hours, the arrogant billionaire was thrown into a freezing, windowless interrogation room at a classified federal holding facility. Stripped of his silk tie, his expensive watch, and his immense ego, Marcus completely broke down. Federal prosecutors relentlessly hammered him with terrifying charges of high-level national security breaches, unauthorized cyber warfare against military intelligence servers, and domestic terrorism. Facing the very real prospect of spending the next 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, Marcus lost all of his remaining dignity. He sobbed hysterically. The powerful apex predator of Denver cried uncontrollably, violently shaking in his metal chair. He frantically confessed to everything, begging for mercy and wildly attempting to throw the blame onto me. "I just wanted to investigate my sister-in-law," Marcus wailed loudly, tears streaming down his face. "She is a fraud. She is lying about being a soldier to get attention. I only wanted to prove she was a fake." The senior intelligence officer sitting across the metal table stared at the weeping billionaire for a long, agonizing moment. Then, the officer let out a low, incredibly dark chuckle. The utter absurdity of a local real estate developer accidentally triggering a black ice defense protocol just to win a petty family argument was almost too ridiculous to comprehend. "Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Rivera," the senior officer said, his voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. "You are walking out of here today with a suspended federal indictment hanging over your head. The only reason we are not throwing you in a dark hole forever is because prosecuting you publicly would require declassifying files that do not exist. But let me give you a piece of advice. You should get on your knees and pray to whatever God you believe in that she never finds out what you did." They threw Marcus out onto the cold street just past midnight. A rational man would have taken the terrifying warning to heart, kissed the ground, and never spoken my name again. But Marcus was fundamentally incapable of accepting defeat. The profound, soul-crushing humiliation of being dragged out of his own building and crying like a child in a federal interrogation room completely shattered his fragile sanity. Instead of waking up, his narcissistic mind doubled down, twisting the reality of the situation to protect his ego. As he stood shivering on the sidewalk, a toxic, paranoid delusion took full control of his brain. He convinced himself that the massive federal response was not a protective measure, but a desperate government cover-up. In his twisted logic, the Pentagon was actively hiding a massive, career-ending scandal. He genuinely believed I was a cowardly disgrace, and the government was simply too embarrassed to admit it. He decided that if he could not defeat me in the digital shadows, he would completely destroy me in the brightest public light possible. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus frantically liquidated hundreds of thousands of dollars from his personal accounts. He used his immense wealth and remaining political connections to hastily organize a massive, incredibly high-profile charity gala honoring local military veterans. He rented out the grand ballroom of the most expensive five-star hotel in the city, inviting local politicians, elite media outlets, and dozens of high-ranking military officers. It was an elaborate, incredibly expensive trap. He cornered Julian, emotionally manipulating his younger brother by claiming the gala was an olive branch, a sincere family effort to make amends for the tension. He practically forced Julian to ensure my attendance. And to guarantee his ultimate victory, Marcus sent a heavily embossed VIP guest of honor invitation directly to General Arthur Sterling. Marcus was planning a public execution. He intended to call me onto the brightly lit stage in front of 500 elite guests and the local press, forcing me to either confess to being a low-level secretary or publicly stumble through a web of lies. He wanted to strip away my armor and watch me crumble in front of the very military brass he thought I was insulting. He was incredibly proud of his brilliant, foolproof trap, entirely unaware that he was simply building his own spectacular guillotine. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive five-star hotel was a masterclass in suffocating opulence. Massive golden chandeliers cast a warm, deceivingly gentle glow over round tables draped in heavy white linen. The room was absolutely packed with the most powerful figures in the state. Wealthy local politicians rubbed shoulders with elite media anchors, while dozens of high-ranking military officers, their dress uniforms adorned with colorful rows of pristine medals, mingled quietly near the open bars. Beneath the polite clinking of champagne flutes and the soft hum of string quartet music, the atmosphere felt incredibly heavy. It was the distinct electric pressure of a brewing hurricane hidden just beneath the surface of a perfectly still ocean. I stood near the entrance, entirely done with blending into the background. For the past 5 years, I had exhausted myself trying to pass as whole, wearing heavy fabrics to conceal the physical toll of my service. Tonight, I wore a stunning deep crimson evening gown designed with a sharp, daring thigh-high slit. With every step I took across the plush carpet, the polished, gleaming titanium shaft of my artificial left leg was clearly visible to the room. I did not try to mask the heavy metallic cadence of my stride. It was a silent, unyielding declaration of self-acceptance, an incredibly difficult peace I had finally made with the ghost of the woman I used to be. Across the crowded floor, Marcus was positively glowing with toxic triumph. He was aggressively working the room, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne and flashing his perfectly bleached teeth for the press photographers. He drifted from table to table, whispering conspiratorially to city councilmen and wealthy investors. He loudly promised everyone that tonight's charity program would feature a special, unscripted presentation honoring the absolute truth, throwing arrogant, thinly veiled glances in my direction. He was utterly convinced that he held the ultimate winning hand. Beside me, Julian was rapidly putting the sickening puzzle pieces together. He watched his brother practically vibrate with malicious excitement, noted the heavy presence of the local media, and saw the predatory gleam in the eyes of Marcus's corporate friends. The color completely drained from Julian's face. He finally realized that this lavish gala was never an olive branch. It was a meticulously funded public execution, a trap designed specifically to humiliate his wife on the grandest stage imaginable. "Sienna," Julian whispered, his voice shaking with a potent mixture of deep regret and sudden anger. "I am so sorry. I was an absolute fool to believe him. We need to leave right now. We can just walk out the front doors and go home." He reached out to pull me toward the exit, but I gently caught his arm. I looked up into his panicked eyes and intertwined my fingers firmly with his. "We are not running, Julian," I said, my voice completely level. "He built this stage to expose the truth. I think it is only fair that we stay and let him hear it." A sharp chime rang through the ballroom, signaling the guests to take their designated seats. The string quartet faded away, replaced by the booming, authoritative voice of the master of ceremonies introducing the host of the evening. Marcus practically leaped onto the brightly lit stage. He adjusted his silk tie, tapped the microphone with a manicured finger, and offered the audience a sickeningly earnest smile. He launched into a lengthy, incredibly fake speech about the profound value of patriotism, the heavy burden of military service, and his own supposed dedication to honoring those who served. The audience offered polite, rhythmic applause, entirely unaware of the venom pooling right beneath his words. "But tonight," Marcus announced, his voice echoing loudly off the gilded ceiling, "I want to take a moment to honor a different kind of service. We often forget the quiet, unremarkable people working in the background, the ones who never see any action, but simply push the necessary paperwork. We actually have someone just like that with us this evening." Marcus pointed directly at our table. The bright, blinding spotlights instantly swung across the ballroom, illuminating me in a harsh circle of white light. Dozens of camera lenses swiveled in my direction. The reporters raised their glowing recording devices. "My very own sister-in-law, Sienna Rivera," Marcus declared, his voice dripping with condescending mock affection. "Come on up here to the podium, Sienna. Come share with this distinguished crowd all about your quiet, safe little desk job in the rear. Tell us all about the absolutely vital coffee you poured while the real heroes were fighting." A confused, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the grand ballroom. The flashing strobe lights of the press cameras began to fire rapidly. On the stage, Marcus smirked, his eyes wide with cruel anticipation. He fully expected me to instantly crumble, to stutter through a pathetic lie, or to simply burst into tears and flee the room in absolute disgrace. I did not move a single muscle. I remained perfectly still in my chair, holding his gaze with dead, hollow eyes. Before the uncomfortable silence could completely swallow the room, a sudden, powerful movement disrupted the VIP tables located directly in front of the stage. General Arthur Sterling abruptly stood up, his dress uniform heavily decorated with the highest honors the nation could bestow. He did not say a word. He simply raised one large, weathered hand in the air, a silent, universally recognized military command to cease all action. The entire ballroom went completely dead. The whispers instantly vanished. The cameras stopped flashing. General Sterling bypassed the small set of stairs and stepped forcefully onto the main stage. His presence alone seemed to suck all the available oxygen straight out of the room. He marched directly up to Marcus, his face completely carved from granite. Without asking for permission, the three-star general aggressively snatched the microphone right out of the billionaire's trembling hand. General Sterling did not look at the crowd. He turned slowly, locking his piercing, battle-hardened eyes directly onto Marcus's suddenly pale, terrified face. "You are calling a hero by the cheapest title your narrow brain can come up with," General Sterling said. His voice was absolutely freezing, slicing through the silent ballroom like a freshly sharpened blade. General Sterling slowly turned away from the trembling billionaire and faced the sea of confused, captivated faces in the grand ballroom. He lifted the microphone, his posture rigid and uncompromising. "At exactly 8 o'clock this morning," the general announced, his voice reverberating through the massive speakers, "the Secretary of Defense personally authorized the immediate, partial declassification of a combat operation that officially never happened. I am standing here tonight to read that citation into the public record." Marcus took a terrified, stumbling step backward, desperately trying to shrink into the heavy velvet curtains of the stage backdrop. 5 years ago, in a nameless frozen valley thousands of miles from this room, General Sterling continued, painting a vivid, horrifying picture with his grave tone, a massive, highly coordinated enemy ambush completely severed all satellite communications for a deeply classified forward operating base. 40 of our most elite special operations soldiers were heavily pinned down in a lethal kill zone. They were completely blind, outgunned, and taking catastrophic casualties. The base itself was under relentless mortar fire. The order was given for all remaining support personnel to immediately evacuate. The general paused, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of his words settle over the dead, silent crowd. "But one operative flatly refused that direct order," General Sterling said, turning his head to look directly at me. "She stayed behind in a crumbling, burning tactical operations center. While the roof was quite literally caving in around her, she manually bypassed the destroyed mainframes, hacking directly into a secure orbital satellite to redraw the blind firing grid for our artillery. When the emergency medical evacuation helicopter finally arrived and took a direct hit to its fuselage, the heavy steel blast doors jammed completely shut." The general's voice hardened, filled with a raw, fierce reverence. "This woman did not hesitate. She ran straight into a merciless hail of incoming machine gun fire. She used her bare, bloodied hands to physically pry those burning metal doors apart. She then repeatedly charged back into the active inferno, dragging her critically wounded brothers out of the dirt one by one. On her final trip into the crossfire, a high explosive mortar shell decimated her position, resulting in the permanent traumatic amputation of her left leg. A sharp collective gasp echoed through the opulent ballroom. Dozens of wealthy socialites covered their mouths in absolute horror. The flashing lights of the press cameras had completely stopped. Everyone was staring at me, at the gleaming titanium shaft reflecting the warm chandelier light. To truly understand the monumental weight of her sacrifice, General Sterling said, lowering the microphone slightly, I will not ask you to simply take my word for it. The general raised his hand and pointed directly toward the darkest corner of the ballroom, right at the very back row of tables. Gentlemen, General Sterling commanded, stand up. In perfect, terrifying unison, 8 massive men wearing identically tailored black suits stood up from their chairs. They moved with the unmistakable, lethal grace of apex predators. Simultaneously, they reached up and removed their dark sunglasses, revealing deeply scarred, hardened faces. These 8 men are drawing breath today purely because of the woman your host just attempted to turn into a cheap punchline, General Sterling declared, his voice rising in volume and intensity. They flew across the entire country tonight, dropping everything in their lives for one single, sacred purpose: to stand guard over the honor of their sister. For 3 agonizing seconds, the ballroom was trapped in absolute, paralyzed silence. Then, the room exploded. It started with a single military officer near the front, who stood up and began clapping fiercely. Within seconds, all 500 guests in the grand ballroom surged to their feet. The deafening, thunderous roar of a massive standing ovation shook the crystal chandeliers above. Highly respected politicians were openly weeping. Hardened media reporters frantically wiped tears from their eyes while their cameras began flashing continuously, completely blinding the stage in a chaotic storm of white light. Up on that stage, Marcus Rivera was completely, utterly destroyed. He stood frozen in place, his entire body shaking violently. His perfectly manicured face was the color of dirty chalk. He looked out at the massive sea of the Denver elite, the powerful billionaires and influential politicians he had spent his entire pathetic life trying to impress. They were not looking at him with respect or admiration. They were staring at him with absolute, unadulterated revulsion, looking at him as if he were a disgusting maggot squirming in the dirt. His elaborate, incredibly expensive trap had flawlessly executed its purpose, only it had cleanly decapitated him instead. 2 hours later, the grand gala finally ended. Julian and I walked quietly out into the freezing night air of the VIP parking garage. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, peaceful exhaustion in my bones. Suddenly, a frantic, disheveled figure stumbled out from the dark shadows between the parked luxury cars. It was Marcus. His custom-tailored Italian suit was entirely ruined, his silk tie ripped open, and his expensive hair hung in greasy, sweat-soaked clumps over his forehead. There was absolutely zero arrogance left in his bloodshot eyes. The scandal had already hit the internet like a digital wildfire. Videos of General Sterling's speech were going viral across every major social media platform. "Sienna, please," Marcus hyperventilated, tears streaming down his face as he desperately blocked our path. "You have to call a press conference right now. You have to tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. My investors are completely pulling out. My corporate stock has tanked 40% in the last hour. The board of directors is going to forcefully remove me by tomorrow morning. I am losing absolutely everything. Please, I am begging you." Julian stepped forward to physically shield me, completely done with his brother's toxic existence. But I gently placed my hand on Julian's shoulder and stepped around him. I looked straight into the hollow, terrified eyes of the man who had spent 5 years trying to make me feel small. I did not feel any anger. I did not feel any pity. I just felt completely, finally free. "The truth is a battlefield, Marcus," I said, my voice incredibly calm but sharp enough to cut through solid bone. "And you just walked into it entirely unarmed." I did not wait for his pathetic response. I turned my back on his weeping, broken figure. I reached out and grabbed Julian's hand, gripping it tightly, and together, we turned and walked away toward our car. As we moved through the quiet, echoing concrete garage, I did not try to soften my stride. I let the heavy metallic clack of my titanium foot strike the pavement with unashamed force. I no longer needed to hide that sound, because I finally knew with absolute certainty that it was not the shameful noise of a physical defect. It was the loud, beautiful, and fiercely proud rhythm of my survival. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.